Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and greetings. Thank you all for joining us, everybody in the live box, as well as people who are going to be watching later. Thank you so much. Today is very special because we have gracing us and contributing some of his valuable time, Dr. David Trobisch, who is an excellent scholar, somebody who is well acquainted with all the different aspects of the New Testament, its compilation, its construction, manuscripts, and has even published in the field of Marcionite studies, which I'm very fascinated with. So, everybody, welcome Dr. David Trobisch.
Nice to be here, Wissam. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much. Yeah, so basically, I want to just begin by acquainting people with your field of specialty. If you can speak about that, what you've been up to, and the things that interest you today.
Um, I have a number of fields that I'm very interested in. And some of those are things that really only I am interested in. Others are fields that have more impact either on the social community or on church community or on culture. And uh, one of the one of the professional highlights in my career as a teacher um, is my participation in putting together the Greek text of the New Testament in an edition that is used by almost all translators in the world. So whatever we do with this Greek text will then be reflected in the French, English, or whatever of the hundreds of translations. Maybe not even during a lifetime, but it will happen. So, and we're working on the 29th edition. The edition is called the Nestle Aland edition or Novum Testamentum Graece, which would be the more correct way, because Nestle and Aland were editors that were doing this job long before we do this. It's a committee of several scholars that have made a name for themselves in the field of New Testament studies, and with a specialty on the transmission of the text, which means the manuscripts. So there's always been one from the Roman Catholic Church, who came sent from the Vatican, one from the Greek Orthodox Church. Interestingly enough, I'm the representative of an American scholarship. I taught in the U.S. for 20 years, and I replaced Bruce Metzger, those who know them, on this committee. And so altogether, we're typically seven, 8 people. We meet on a very regular basis, sometimes every day, twice a year. We meet for a week. Then once a week, if things need to get finished, or typically once a month, where we decide certain things that are coming up with this edition.
Awesome. And that's this right here for everybody who's interested. I'm sure you've seen me using it a few times when when discussing certain variants or
Yeah.
certain aspects, but this is what it looks like. This is the ESV edition, so it has like the English translation on this page, and then the
Yeah.
apparatus and the
Uh,
Greek text on this page.
yeah. Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about what goes into that? Are you and the committee members generally agreed upon with your methodology on how to select one manuscript over another, or like one reading from a cluster of manuscripts over another? I know there are different schools of thought. So I
Mhm.
just finished reading
Yeah.
Keith Elliott's book on the application of thoroughgoing principles. Him and Kilpatrick, they basically prioritize internal evidence over what the age and number of manuscripts are. What
Yeah.
what philosophical textual persuasion are you of, and is that generally the view of the committee as a whole?
Well, nice for this introduction, Wisdom. So I see you're one of us,
No, not really.
studying the problems and understand that you cannot reconstruct the text, an ancient text, without having some kind of a scholarly or whatever theory.
Mhm.
If I may say that every reader has a theory when they open a book and they read. Yeah. So when you open a book by Kafka, you think you're listening to the voice of this author writing in Prague at the beginning of the 20th century. And so many people, when they open the Bible, they also have a very particular sense, a personal sense of what they're doing. Just to give you an example, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, many people will just say, well, this is what Jesus said. Yeah. And they will quote Jesus literally and put it in quotation marks. And this is what this guy said who lived. Well, here we already start being in the dark from a scholarly point of view, because we can't really date it, neither the birth nor the death from the records that have survived. But for a reader, that is not important. If you read a book, you trust. It's you listen to the voice, you open your heart. Otherwise, you couldn't read a mystery story or anything like that, or the phone book. Yeah, things you're probably not of that age group anymore that knows what.
No, I remember. I remember the Yellow Pages. Yeah,
Yeah.
I used it quite often.
Or let's say you look up something in a book, you just sort of trust it. The phone book is supposed to give you numbers that actually exist. So there's this, and when it comes to the New Testament, so we're talking about New Testament today, not Old Testament. We're talking about a collection of 27 writings that was already published in antiquity. In this format, 27 writings has 4 Gospels, 14 letters of Paul, 7 letters written by the apostles, James, Peter, John, and the brother of Jesus, Judas. And so we have this concept that these 27 writings somehow belong together. If you take some of them out, it wouldn't be the New Testament anymore. So that is a very important thing to realize, that when we put out an edition of the New Testament, we're not putting out what Jesus said, but we're putting out a book that was published at some point in antiquity. Our oldest manuscripts go back to about the 2nd century. But the first complete copies of the New Testament, Codex Vaticanus and Atticus, are usually dated into the 4th century. So this is what we're talking about when we're trying to reconstruct the text. We're not reconstructing what Jesus said. We're just giving you the text. And from there, historical scholars might try to go back and say, well, here Jesus says, if you're with me, anyone who's not with me is against me. In the other gospel, it says not everyone who's not against me is with me. It says just about the opposite. Well, it could only have said one of those two things, probably, or could he have said one? So these are questions. Then you go back and see maybe it's not even by Jesus. Yeah, maybe an editor put something. Someone must have given, for example, the titles of the gospel. Gospel according to Matthew. Matthew never says in this book that my name is Matthew and I wrote this book. Yeah.
Yeah.
And even Gospel of Luke, the word Luke is never mentioned anywhere. So, but the editors give you some kind of an information. Now, when we reconstruct the New Testament, we try to reconstruct this collection of 27 writings. So if we have information that is older than the New Testament, like you mentioned Marcionite research, this has resurfaced the past years, we may actually have a gospel that is older than the New Testament, and that may have been used, very likely, in my opinion, was used by Gospel of Luke. It's about a third shorter, so Luke would have added 30% if that theory is correct. But what we're doing as editors, we don't care about these theories. Yeah? We just give you the evidence. That's the place where we all start from, and then we try to reconstruct, if you're interested at all, in what was older than the New Testament. Where did you have the information from? And so are completely different questions. You can see, for example, I know that you're familiar with Islamic studies.
Yeah.
If you look at the New Testament from the point of view of the Quran or of Jesus, you will see, as a scholar, you will see what the Germans call the Wirkungsgeschichte, the history of impact of a text as it is reinterpreted in a different context a few hundred years later. You can do the same thing in the Reformation time, where the Protestant movement started as a Bible reading movement, and they developed a certain understanding of these texts. Then you're really not interested what Jesus says. You're more interested what the 16th century is going to tell you, and why this speaks to them. And you can easily do it for our time. For example, when I started out as a theologian, the big issue was, could women be ordained or not? Because you have a verse in Timothy that says women cannot teach in the church. Well, this is all history. Hardly anyone cares about that anymore.
Yeah.
The last classes that I taught, there were way more women in there. They were all going to be ordained. And the first class that I took was in Bavaria, where that year the women still were not ordained. So we had, of course, very few women studying with me. So you see these questions. What the New Testament is much more complicated than it seems. Even if you can reconstruct the text and have unanimous vote of the leading scholars of the world that this is what the first line was in the New Testament Gospel, Matthew chapter 6, verse 2. This doesn't mean that Jesus said that. This is a completely different question. Mm-hmm. Every pastor that gets on a pulpit on Sunday has the right to tell you what Jesus means. You shouldn't support nuclear power plants because that is against what you. Well, this is their job, and it's okay. And I'm not trying to belittle it. A little bit of a long introduction, but it seems really necessary. To explain what the editors are and what they not are. Now, it would be nice if we had like an original New Testament and a few copies of that, and then we could immediately discern what the mistakes are as the copyist. Every time you copy something by hand, you may make a mistake, no matter how hard you try. It just happens. And that would be easy, but that's not the case. We have to work from the other way around. We don't have the oldest and then explain to, and this is the NRSV translation, the most recent translation. We can't do that. We have the NRSV and we can tell you what they used. They probably used my edition.
They did, I think, yeah.
And we say that, to do that. And then we can ask further back, what is this based on? And of course, we have printed editions, starting with the 16th century Erasmus, that still have an enormous impact, even on the reconstruction of the Greek text. It's a little bit ridiculous, but we're following, for example, the arrangement of the books of the New Testament as Erasmus had it in the 16th century. But we have manuscripts from the 4th century, and it's absolutely no question that arrangement has nothing to do with the oldest, with the first edition of the New Testament. The biggest difference is you have the 4 Gospels in exactly the same sequence: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But then you have another. Let me put it this way: the New Testament is too big to have it as a manuscript, to have it bound in one volume. This took a long time until they were able to do that in the 5th century. So it's broken up in 4 volumes. One volume is called the 4 Gospels, and then it says Gospel according to, and then you get the different book titles, Matthew, Mark. The next volume is called Letters of Paul 14. So there are 14 letters of Paul, that is the title. And then to distinguish where they begin and where it's just according to the address, to the Romans, to the Corinthians the first, to Corinthians the second, and goes through 14 letters. So the letter to Hebrews is part of the letters of Paul, and it follows after 2 Thessalonians and before 1 Timothy, right in the middle. But most printed editions that you have today will have it Hebrews at the end of the letters of Paul, sort of disguising, has nothing to do with Paul, the name Paul is not mentioned, such and such. So it makes it easy to have it at the end. But all the manuscripts don't have it there. They have it right smack in the middle of the collection. It's the last letter that Paul writes to a community. And after that, it is followed by the letters that Paul writes to an individual, to Timothy, to Titus, to Philemon. So it makes complete sense.
So that way, like P46 would be in that same configuration.
P46 is that's a good example. Let's do that. Then I can explain what the board is struggling with. P46 is what is usually held to be the oldest copy of the letters of Paul that has survived in a not completely complete, but it really has a lot of letters. This is an interesting book because it's
A single choir.
it's a one choir book. It's like this one here. Yeah. So the outer page is one page. The second page is the second from the beginning, the second from the last. So
Yep.
they put a lot of pages on top of each other, and then they fold it. Now, if you do that, and you start to write on the first page, you are aware that you cannot add another blank page at the end. If you would do that, you would have an empty page at the beginning.
Yeah.
And the other thing that P46 did not know is that if you put a pile of paper together, this is already cut, it will stick out in the middle. Yeah, you see, because the paper is so thick, the papyrus, that the inner leaves will, no one wants a book that looks like shaped like that. So they would cut it off, but it was strange. Now they had to cut off so much that in the middle page, you only have, there's much less room than on the outer pages for the text. It's actually a third less. So what happened in P46 is you would write so many lines on every page, and write it. And then when he passed over the middle page, he recalculated and thought, oh, my dear, I made a mathematical mistake. I will not have enough room. So he starts to put more lines on every page and squeeze more letters in every line, and still he doesn't make it. The outer few pages are lost. So it starts with Romans chapter 6. So the first 6, we can add that to the end because they are, of course, also lost. But it still wouldn't make up for the letters of Paul as we know it. You wouldn't get all the 14 letters in there. And so now you have scholars going rampant, everyone having great theories and ideas. Interestingly enough, very often the page number has survived, so there's you have another thing to calculate. It's a lot of fun. That particular manuscript is dated to about 200. That's what you read in all the books. It's one of those examples where I just think this is baseless. This is people really. It could be 200, yeah, no question. But there's no real reason to assume it, except that the first recension that was written about it by Wilken said it looks like something from 200. Yeah. Well, that doesn't mean anything if it doesn't give any kind of thing. But it has been used since then to date other manuscripts that have no date. If they look like P46, they're also very old. Yeah.
Comparandus.
And so there's really interested in these discussions of dating. There's a lot. Scholars are having a lot of fun of debunking all these old theories.
I have Brent NB's book here. I think he's like ahead of that.
Yeah, he's
Clarice and
his take is really good on it because he does it with absolutely new eyes, and he's open to other methodologies. This is a breath of fresh air, but still, we need to, we would like to have some real good ways to date these manuscripts. It would be very helpful. Yeah. I'm sure you've heard about carbon dating, but that was.
That also surprised me. Why a lot of these papyri aren't carbon dated, or because Brent NB said there's even a dispute about Sinaiticus, whether it's 4th century or 5th century. So he's pushing for the parchment to get.
I would also say it's true for Codex Vaticanus. To say that it's 4th century, everyone says that. Well, yeah, could be. It could also be older.
Right.
If you're interested in that debate, for example, when the Sinaiticus was discovered by Konstantin Tischendorf, he, of course, like every discoverer, wants to have the oldest, the oldest manuscript. I found the oldest Bible, just imagine. And he has to do his fundraising and such. So he wanted to date it into the 3rd century, but he couldn't because it has the canons of Eusebius, who lived during Constantine's period, so it's beginning in the first half of the 4th century. So he grudgingly had to move it into the 4th century. And that's what typically happens when they date. They go back as far as they possibly can, and then they look for arguments that cannot be supported at the time.
Yeah.
Now, Codex Vaticanus, which is usually seen as being older. It's being seen older because it does not have the canons of Eusebius.
Mm.
So this is very tricky if you're dating something by evidence that does not exist. Yeah, this is like
It's kind of circular.
the Sumerians. The Sumerians already had telephones. How do you know? Well, they found little pieces of wire. Oh, wow. And the Babylonians, they already had cell phones. Why? Yeah, they couldn't find any wires. Yeah. So you see, it's very difficult. Now the carbon dating, I'd be hard pressed to say that which manuscripts have not been carbon dated. This is typically, I think everyone has, but it has its. I mean, any new discoveries that I'm familiar with have been carbon dated. So I wouldn't be quite as. The problem is with the method. Carbon dating was developed for prehistoric datings. Yeah? A dinosaur to get in close, 100,000 years. You can do that by looking at the Halbwert. I'm not sure what the English word is. The nuclear, the radiocarbon. When a tree, you can tell with organic matter how long it has been aging by the time you find it. But what we need for manuscripts are not something that is within 50 years or 100 years. Yeah, it makes a difference if it's 200 or 120. Yeah, or 360. Yeah, for a dinosaur bone it doesn't make a difference, but for us it does. So typically, the ranges you get are enormous. Because you're familiar with Quran studies, you might have heard of the big debate around the page that was found at the University of Birmingham.
The Birmingham map.
Yeah, the oldest thing. My God, that was written even before Muhammad lived. According to carbon dating. You get a wide range, and then it depends on the attitude of the scholar, and if it's a discoverer, it's even very personal, very emotional. Which part of the range you take? But you easily have several hundred years where you can base them. And some, of course, could have been written before Muhammad. Yeah, that's clearly.
Yeah.
But
and
because
paleography then takes over a little bit.
There's some variations in there, so it's probably not after the text was fully established, and such. You can go there. So carbon dating is not the kind of foolproof that many people hope for. Especially in the evangelical community, I've often encountered people who just think, I don't like scholars thinking about things. Scholars are always evil and wrong. And it's this old tradition of the New Testament as well. The scribes, have a really negative thing, scribes and the Pharisees, terrible. And you find that in the evangelical community very often. If you don't agree with what they believe in, then it's scholarship that's wrong. So the hope to date a manuscript without having to go through dating the handwriting, or other scholarly ways of looking at it, has a bad rep. And so they were hoping that carbon dating would, you just put it in there, it comes out, the machine at Walmart, and it comes out and it dates it for you. Unfortunately, the method it doesn't work quite that way. You still need to have markers around it. It is, when you listen to people who've done it a long time, you wonder if it's not an art.
Yeah.
Paleography, it's not a skill, it's an art. The data you get, and then the other problem is you send it to two different labs, and you might get different results. How do you date with that? It's not that kind of hope. You just put it in.
It's probabilistic. It's probabilistic, just like textual, just like any art/science. I know Eldon Epp, he tried to make a distinction between the scientific aspects of textual criticism, which is like the date of the manuscript, the actual variations in it, and then like the art, like which one do you prefer, and for which criteria do you use? Which brings me back to my question, like when you're in the committee, how often do you guys like agree immediately, or is there like big debates that are had on certain readings? Because of
Yeah,
philosophy or because of what
this
people?
is it's good. So let's go back to P46 to
Mm,
say what the problem with the editors is. Yeah,
mhm.
it seems like a weird way to go around. If you look at P46, it begins with a letter to Romans. It only has the letters of Paul. Yeah, it begins with a letter to the Romans. It is then followed by the letter to the Hebrews. There's not one other manuscript that has that. We have about 780 copies of the letters of Paul. No other manuscript has Hebrews in the second place. And then there's also Ephesians and Galatians are turned around, where we have the regular Bibles have Galatians and then Ephesians. In P46, you have Ephesians and then Galatians, which is also absolutely unusual thing, you know.
Mhm.
And then you get sort of, oh, where does this come from? Yeah, where was it discovered? And it turns out it comes from Egypt. The story is quite interesting. They sold half of it to the U.S., half of it to the Chestabidi Library, without the two people knowing that they all had half of the same manuscript.
Wow.
And so the Americans were the first ones to publish the first edition of P46. And of course, they had the page numbers, and they knew this was a really weird. They put out their theory how the whole thing looked like. You know? And then they received a call from the Chesterfield Library and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we just
Somebody
found
else
it.
had the other half.
We have the other half, and by the way, everything you wrote about it is wrong." Yeah. So, which is a wake-up call for exactly the kind of work that the editorial committee does. You can put out your best reasoning and your best arguments, and if, which is very rare, that your theory can actually be proven right or wrong, like it was the case for P46,
Mhm.
you may find out that you were put your money on the wrong horse. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so this is really important because it's hard work. This is not a holy. This is not like you pray about it and then you say this is what Jesus said. You know, it's just scholarly work that has to be done. Now I have to continue with P46 because it's such a wonderful example for that. Now you wonder, well, who could use such a Bible, letters of Paul that doesn't fit to what the other people have in their pews, so to say, and then you go and look for it, and you see that this thing has so many mistakes. You just look at one, the first page of Second Corinthians makes absolutely no sense. He's left out whole lines, you know, without it's completely unreadable. And then you look again at it and see, well, but there are not that many corrections. There's some corrections, and you realize, okay, this has never been used. This was thrown away. And where was it found? Where it was found on a dump site. Most of our oldest manuscripts that we have of the New Testament come from dump sites. So they come from Egypt, and everything along the Nile is green and is farmed, and it's very very important. But if you have something to throw away, like your tax records, which are often next to biblical,
Yeah.
you go outside of the oasis, you go outside of where the green is, and put it in and throw it away. And this is sand, and the sand has preserved it. You know, it never rains, so it doesn't rot. So ironically, the oldest manuscripts that we have, some of the oldest manuscripts that we have are so bad at the time when they were produced that they were thrown away. And the good ones that they used at the same time we don't have anymore because they continue to be used. So all of this, you need to know if you're talking about what we call the external evidence of a manuscript. Yeah. So you said there's an internal evaluation, there's an external evaluation. It would be nice if we could just say, well, this is the oldest manuscript, so we go with this text. Yeah. But unfortunately, the oldest manuscript, like in the case of P46, is the worst one that has survived of the letters of Paul. And P72 is also one with it's like that. It's not even Bible manuscript. It has other texts in it as well.
Yeah.
And so now you find an interesting reading. So now what happens? We have about 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, so meaning handwritten copies that contain part or the whole New Testament. because the New Testament couldn't be bound together easily for a long time. Of the 6,000, only 51 copies have all 4 volumes bound in one. Yeah, the other 6,000 have typically only one of these volumes, either the Gospel volume, Letters of Paul volume, or this is the third one that is different from our modern Bibles. It's called the Praxapostolos. Praxis is the word for Praxis Apostolon for the Acts of Apostles, and then the letters of Peter, John, and Jude. Yeah, so these are always bound together. The Book of Acts introduces what we call the Catholic letters. This is one volume. Once you realize that, you understand, oh my dear, the first half of Acts is really about James, John, Peter, and the brothers of Jesus. And then you see that the Catholic letters are about James, Peter, John, and Judas. This is really an introduction to these letters. It really does belong together. And not having had that in printed copies since Erasmus, has given the Book of Acts some kind of a feeling as if this was a completely separate book. No, it is an introduction to this. And then the second part of Acts is just about Paul. Paul is the main character. And right in the middle of Acts chapter 15, Peter and Paul shake hands.
Yeah.
So you see that Book of Acts really introduces all the letters. It belongs together. There's an editorial narrative going there. First, the letters of the apostle leaders, the Jerusalem leaders, and then the letters of Paul. Yeah, and then we of course know that Acts is the second book that Luke wrote. So it also makes a link to the 4 Gospel volume. Yeah, because the Gospel of Luke is there. If you want to, you read the Gospel of Luke, and the title will say Gospel according to Luke, and say, who's Luke? You can read through the whole 4 Gospel book, you won't find the name.
Right.
And then you come to Acts and to the Praxapostolos, the beginning of Acts. This is the second volume that I write. Oh, okay, now you know this is the second part. The same guy who wrote Luke also wrote Acts. So but Luke is not mentioned as the author in this book. But Luke tells about travels of the author travels with Paul. There are passages where he says, we were there. And he's with Paul at the end in Rome, last chapter 28 in Acts. So then you start reading the letters of Paul, the one volume I haven't read yet, and there, sure enough, you find a Luke. Yeah, and Luke says he was the only one with me in Rome in the letters to Timothy. Oh gosh, so you have to know the 4 Gospel book, you have to know the Book of Acts, you have to know the letters of Paul to understand who the writer is in the title of the Gospel book. So there is an editorial narrative. These are not 27 writings that just haphazardly, some gathered these, some gathered. You read these theories all the time, in scholarly books. No, it really, this is based on wishful thinking, as if we had anything that was really old, and then it survived here a little bit and there a little bit. No, we have something that shows up in one big beat by the middle of the 2nd century.
Wow.
By 180, we know it exists. And that is what the editors are trying to edit. So for example, if you have just a fragment of a papyrus, I'm sorry, this is not, you can't treat it as if this was out of the New Testament. It could be older. It could be a precursor. It could just be a note, which we have. We have in Vienna, for example, I saw papyri where the Bible text was used for school children to learn to write. So they do their best, and then the teacher corrects it. That is not a New Testament. That is not, does not have the same value, although it has that New Testament text. But we would never correct the oldest reconstructed text by using a scribal exercise from the 7th century.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't.
No. I was gonna say, like, so you think that it was published and disseminated at one point, intended for all those 27 books to be together?
Yes, but it's
as a
not.
collection.
Yeah, it's not that I think that. It sounds like I made that up or so.
No.
Just saying, from a scholarly point of view, you are not committed necessarily to a faith. I'm a Lutheran, yeah, say that, and you're not. But I'm not committed to Lutherans' anti-Semitism of the 16th century. I can still be a Lutheran, yeah. So,
Yeah.
but you are almost religiously committed to interpreting evidence. So every theory you have has to explain a theory. Theoria, Greek, is what you see when you're in a football game and you're an audience and you're watching the athletes compete. That's theoria. You have the overview. But this theory has to be based on actually something you see. You must watch athletes in order to say this was the fastest one. Yeah. And theory is not sitting back and praying about it and having strong feelings and then saying, yeah, but God said this or such and that. Not that that's of no value, but this is not what scholars do. Scholars say we found evidence, and even if the evidence points us to things that are different from what we were taught in our faith community, with our scholarly community, I don't ask if they go to church, if they're Jewish, which languages. I don't. The only thing I ask in these conversations is, what evidence are you looking at? And so if you look at the evidence of a collection of literature, and let's not even look at biblical literature, letters of Plato, yeah, for example, anything in antiquity, you can distinguish easily, looking at the manuscripts, you can distinguish if the archetype of that tradition goes back to one copy, or if there were a lot of different early copies that then were mingled and combined somehow. Both of them are possibilities. The Apostolic Fathers is something that we use. We pull it out of our bookshelves and look it up. It never exists in manuscript form. This was first collected in the 16th century as a printed copy. And if you look at it today, you see that really the Apostolic Fathers in different collections have different arrangements, different numbers of writings. There's nothing like that. And the opposite of that would be like Sherlock Holmes, yeah, where there are 4 large volumes of collections that he himself, Arthur Conan Doyle, during his lifetime, were published, yeah. Well, that is a canon, yeah, and they actually also use the word, the canon of Sherlock Holmes or something like that. Now, he wrote other stories where Sherlock Holmes is also they are now part of the canon. Yeah? Because you have a tradition, a text tradition. And this is something you can do, as I say, and you should do with any literature written in antiquity that is in a collection. So collections are a specific genre. Yeah, you have letter collections, or so, my dissertation was about letter collections in antiquity, and I looked at everyone that was published in antiquity between 300 BC and 400 AD. Yeah, so it's a lot of material, and 9 out of 10 are letters that were never in the mailbox. They are a way to express yourself as a poet, as a writer. Yeah? Some are poetry, yeah? Like Horatius or Ovid, so they write letters of poetry as poetry. So you learn all kinds of things, but with these collections, you can say if they go back to one archetype, as we call it, the oldest, or not. And with the New Testament, if it is defined by 27 writings in 4 volumes, if you open the Nestle Aland edition, yeah, and you look at where the manuscripts are listed, you see that each manuscript can be described with one small letter. Yeah, it's E for Evangelion, yeah? Tetraevangelion, which is the Greek title of that volume. It's A for Acts and Catholic letters. It's only one letter. Mm-hmm. And then you have P for Paul, and you have R for the Book of Revelation. Book of Revelation is always kept separate. You didn't really have to buy it or read it or so. We have only about 80 copies of Revelation, but we have 2,500 of the 4 Gospel books. Right. The differences. So if a body of text, if a collection is transmitted with basically always in the same arrangement and always the same number, I mean, within the four volumes, you just have no choice as a scholar but to say it goes back to a first edition. Yeah, this is an archetype, and this is what we're looking for. Can we date this? Can we think about it? As interesting, as simple as this may sound, the work really is in its infancy. People are not really interested when it was first published. They want to know what Jesus had to say.
And
it's just how it is. It's like with the Quran, you have the same thing. The first time it's really codified, you're already 1 to 2 centuries away from the oldest, from when it was written down for the first time. Yeah, but you have a very clear edition of the Quran. When you go in a bookstore, they will give you one. It has this number of surahs. It has this arrangement. If you look, and everyone will tell you it's exactly the same text, but if you look a little closer, like take an Indonesian Quran and compare it with the edition that is now put out by the Saudis, or compare it to the one that was earlier put out by in Egypt, 1924, you see that there are quite differences in the top part of every surah. Yeah? That date it and that gives some background information. It's still considered part of the text, but at the same time, everyone understands that someone is talking about the surah, like the title. Yeah.
Yeah.
The different ways you can either take the first lines of the surah, or you can give it a title, a traditional title about it. Well, they are different in 2 different copies of the Quran. And still, you will not find anyone in the faith community to say that there's even just one difference in text. Yeah? And you have that, the transmission of Quran is a little bit in a pre-critical status, if I may say that as an outsider. We went through that in the New Testament research already in the 1750, so in the 18th century, that it was discovered that their printed texts do not cover the manuscript tradition. And the first critical editions were put out and said, well, I mean, a printed text, we know who put it together, Erasmus put it together, and we constantly tried to get better than that. And that, at the beginning of the 20th century, just broke down, because it turns out that if you compare 6,000 manuscripts, there's not one sentence in the New Testament that has exactly the same wording in each of these manuscripts. Not one sentence. And then why should we start with the printed edition, which is the latest? Why not do the whole work again and start just with the manuscripts? Yeah? And this is what what the philosophical concept is around this particular edition, the Nestle Aland edition. Let's just pretend it has never been printed. Yeah, let's just go back to the manuscripts. Until the 15th century, every book from antiquity had to be copied by hand if it was reproduced. There was no shortcut. And in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, where we have a lot of records about book production, it was usually done through dictation. Later in medieval times, the Bible becomes something that monks actually copy, one copy into one copy or so. But if you copy through dictation, you put 50 people in one room, at the end you'll have 50 copies. But they will not be identical, because even as you hear, you interpret it a little different. Okay, you back again?
Yeah. I think the connection was lost for a second.
Yeah, it's all right.
Apologies.
Yeah. So, what we do then is, or what has been done in the history of this particular tradition, is that you go from sentence to sentence. Let's put it this way: what manuscripts do we have? What variants do we have? And then we call them variants. And if you have 2 manuscripts that had 2 different texts, then it's a variant if you compare them. And then you have to decide, well, if there was an archetype, which tried to show that there was, of the New Testament, it could only have one of those variants in the oldest version. And so you try to discern which of these is. And this is where your distinction comes in about the external evidence. You hope that an older manuscript from the 4th, 5th century is closer to the archetype than a manuscript from the 12th century. That's not necessarily true.
Oh, the case,
And
yeah.
I'm jumping around. Maybe said 1739, for example, is a copy of Letters of Paul and the Apostolos, and it has in the margin on the first page, this is a copy of a manuscript of an older manuscript. We had to copy it because it was falling apart. And this older manuscript said that it was a hand copy of Pamphilus. Pamphilus is a librarian of Origen. Whoa, we're in the beginning of the 3rd century. Yeah,
Yeah.
You're looking at a 10th century manuscript that preserves readings that actually, in the margin, that actually we know from manuscripts that have only survived out of that papyri or so, out of that period, and say, yes, we're actually looking at something that Origen would have had in his hand library, so to say. So this external evidence, interpreting that, is also, you have to be very knowledgeable. And I would say that most of my New Testament professor colleagues, I'm professor of New Testament, I Habilitación, University of Heidelberg, and taught here for 12 years, and went to the US and taught there. For 1 year, I was also an associate professor at Yale Divinity School. Americans always tell me I need to mention that, but usually I don't. I teach students. I don't teach theories. But are you back again? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I don't know why the connection keeps dropping.
Yeah.
But you were talking about the external evidence.
Yeah. So the external evidence you need to know a little more. Like it just showed this with P46. That this is a copy that was thrown away. It's really important knowledge. You shouldn't just because it's the oldest one we probably have doesn't mean it has the text of the archetype. And in other cases, like the case with the school children learning to write, this is a different genre. This is not a copy of the New Testament. Yeah, so you have to look at it also in a very knowledgeable way. And the other approach is when you look at the internal evidence, there are certain things that happen when texts are copied or reproduced. One of them is that editors will typically make a text easier to understand, make it more readable. So if there's an expression there, you can see that with our revisions of the King James to the New King James Version or so, there's sometimes words that are not understood anymore, and they are then replaced with a English word that is now in use. Everyone needs to learn it. Yeah, and I can understand it without any. That, of course, happens in the New Testament as well, because Greek is a living language that was spoken. The handwritten period copies 1,200, 1,300 years. In those 1,300 years, every language develops. I have to think between Shakespeare and us, and it's really no time at all. We may already have difficulty understanding it. And so if the rule is, if a text is easier to understand, we have two variants. Yeah, one is easy, one is difficult. Then we say that one that is easier to understand is probably an editorial embellishment or trying to make it more readable. So you end up with a more difficult reading as probably the one being in the archetype. And here comes, with this rule, for example, the irony that every first edition of any printed text is a text with the most printing errors. The second edition, they'll try to eliminate them. They get all these bad reviews. And talk about my own books, if they show up in the second, third edition, you read all the reviews again and you make sure that you don't reproduce that mistake again. So, but you also know the first edition has a mistake. There's no reason to put a mistake into something. Yeah? There's a reason to take it out. The other observation is, this has nothing to do with biblical scholarship, any text from antiquity. The other observation is if scribes actually see two manuscripts of the same text, and the more learned the edition is, the more scholarly the manuscript is, the more likely this is to happen. They have to decide what to do with a variant. Yeah? So let's see. Thaddeus. Yeah, there's a well, there in the Gospel of Matthew, the list of the 12 apostles.
Yeah.
There's one apostle that has in the manuscripts different names. Thaddeus, who and
Levius.
yeah, and so you could, what should you do? So some scribe says Thaddeus, who's also called whatever.
I think it's called Labius.
Yeah, Lebeus, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what it doesn't matter. You can, but you cannot say, you cannot have both there, both names. Otherwise, you have 13 apostles.
Right.
In other cases, it doesn't matter if where you have both.
I think the same phenomena occurs in Mark with James and Levi as well.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So you see, they come across a name that they don't know, and they remember, oh, Levi was called, oh, that's Matthew. Yeah, and it's the same story. Yeah, he's called Levi in Mark, and he's called Matthew in the Gospel of Matthew. And then you may want to change Levi into Matthew, and it's because you know both texts. And so this is scribes do that. We call those parallels. If you have a reading, if you have a variant in one gospel that simply copies out the text of another gospel, we know that the archetype did not, which text the archetype had. Yeah. So, but the phenomenon is if they try to combine readings, to conflate readings, instead of deciding which one is the oldest, if they have two readings that disagree with each other, here they're frightened and here they have a lot of fear. They say they were very frightened and had a lot of fear. Yeah. And then you know that this tradition knew both variants.
Yeah.
But we, as the editors, have to decide which of these two, to be frightened or to have fear, was actually the wording in the archetype. So, and these two rules, that the shorter reading is probably the older. Yeah, if you have the combined reading and just two single readings, you know the single readings are older, but you still don't know which one.
Yeah. And when we say older, I know there's also another debate within textual criticism of how much you can reconstruct. So there's people who are more charitable, and they'll say, yeah, you can actually, like the goal of textual criticism, whether it's to like reconstruct the authorial text, or whether there's an initial text after certain redactions have been done, or just an archetype of the manuscript. Like how what is
The
your
term,
stance on this?
the term of initial text, is just another word for the text of the archetype. Here, the theory is that the whole tradition really goes back to a first edition. That was my first book, first edition of the New Testament, and you have to know about this. And now with the Nestle Aland Committee, we talk about the initial text. Yeah, so because also to protect us from the misunderstanding that the initial text necessarily is also the text that Paul wrote or that Jesus said. Yeah, it's just we're talking about a book, about the first edition of a book. This text is what we recreate. Much of these thoughts and these "be careful" is not what we say, or so is of course completely lost on the audience. It just came back from a trip to Cameroon, and where I helped work on. Was also translation consultant for American Bible Society, and last 10 years I've worked with the translation into Bassa. I was born in Cameroon. I grew up in Cameroon. Bassa was the African language that I spoke as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and so they've now putting together the first edition of that translation, and they of course use the Greek text when they translated, as if this is what Jesus said and what Paul wrote. Right? We, as the editors of the edition, do not claim that. It's always if you any specialist in any scholarly field or scientific field, the more they know, the more they discover how little they know. And so you see that phenomenon as well. Often, for example, I hear, well, the little changes that you make in this text are really nothing, it's just take out a word here, take one there, but the meaning is always the same, and it does not change. This is not quite correct. because during my lifetime, the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman is not part of the New Testament anymore. It was taken out.
Mhm.
And these are quite substantial.
Yeah. I think the audience, because I don't want to. I think I only have you for an hour, so there's only a few more minutes. But the audience wants to ask a few questions. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, oh, sure. Let's do that.
Thank you so much. So I guess the first question here actually might not be relevant for you, to be honest, but we can ask.
Well, when would you date the creed in Corinthians 15, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's this. It is relevant because it addresses exactly what editors of the New Testament cannot do and answer. Because here the question is based on Paul has agreed. It's the only time that Paul writes about Jesus died on the third day, he was resurrected, and first he appeared to James, and then he appeared to a crowd of 500, and at the very end he appeared to me. Yeah, it is really important because this information is nowhere in the Gospels. Jesus does not appear to James first,
Yeah.
to Peter first, James. Where are the women? And to 500 people, not one thing that he mentions there as proof that this actually happened is repeated in the four gospel volume. So this is a really good question. And for example, one answer would be, well, of course, Paul lived before the Gospels were written, yeah? So this must be the older source, yeah? And the Gospel writers somehow felt that they didn't need to write about these stories, or the last sentence of the four Gospel book. Oh, if we would write everything down that we know about Jesus, the whole world would know the book. So it's just, you can come up with all kinds of solutions for that. But why do you think that Paul is older than the Gospels? Why would you think so? If you read the Gospel of Mark, at face value, he presents himself as being the secretary of Peter, who wrote everything down that Peter dictated, and Peter endorses it in 2 Corinthians, and in First Peter and in 2 Peter. He says, I wrote that down. Yeah, and Mark is the guy who, he's next to me. This is absolutely consistent. If you look at the archetype as a literary book that is linked to each other, how do I know who is Luke? I have to read the rest. How do I know who is Mark? Well, you better read the letters of Peter, in order to understand that, and the book of Acts. And then you understand who this is. So why would Paul be writing before Peter? You could turn that around. But if a question comes like that, probably they've heard in school or from somewhere in books that Mark was written before 70 and Matthew and Luke were written afterwards. And Paul, of course, must be older, maybe in the 50s, 40s, 50s or so. And so it becomes a good question. You only ask this question because you bought full scale into the editorial narrative of the New Testament that presents it to you as if the letters of Paul were actually written before the Gospels, and then the editorial narrative of your scholarly teachers who say, we can date the Gospels approximately. Yeah, so it becomes that. So you have to make a choice with any kind of literature. If you want to read it at face value, take it as literature, which is my suggestion for the New Testament. Fits everything nice together, and I could answer you this question immediately and say, yeah, of course it's older. It's older than what the Gospels have. This is what the New Testament tells you. Yeah. At the same time, as a critical scholar, I must say, I really don't know if the New Testament existed before 150. We really can't go further back than that. And as we have more than 100 other Gospels that were published in the 2nd century. So the sentence, if we would write everything down and publish that was written about
That
Jesus.
reminds me, this is one of the first statements that you made in the book about how many books were circulating before the end of the 2nd century. So if you guys are interested, definitely pick up.
And none of those books has any kind of historical credibility. So why would the four Gospels all of a sudden be this perfect historical source? From a form critical perspective, it is not at all likely. So I would say, to answer the question about 1 Corinthians 15, how old is it? What I can say with certainty is that it reflects it reflects someone in the 2nd century thinking what Paul would have written. Yeah. If you had any kind of basis for that or not, unfortunately, we're not able to tell.
Yeah.
But here's a storyteller in the 2nd century, and for him, this is what it looks like. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah,
And he will know that you read the Gospels because it's part of the same book. Yeah,
Mhm.
and he will enjoy it. So he will use it as an additional information that was not said in the Gospels. He does not want to be a separate source that ridicules the Gospels. No, it has to be read in addition. Like you would, for example, the Gospel of James, the brother of Jesus, who gives you information that you don't find in the beginning of Luke and beginning of Matthew. And he tells you how Mary could be a virgin even after Jesus' birth. All the questions that might come up as you read the 4 Gospels. You have to add it in addition. He's not correcting it.
And this next question is actually even relevant to the first one, because I know in the Apostolos that creed is slightly different. So the person is asking, why is Marcion's gospel before Mark?
Yeah, that's a different. If you may follow my follow my thoughts for a moment.
Oh, yeah. Take your time.
They might be might be unusual. You may never have heard it. But if the New Testament is understood as a publication of the 2nd century, then they most certainly must have had something that is older that they used. They would not have been able to interview Jesus. Yeah? And if you ask the question that way, there's actually one gospel. We call it the Gospel of Marcion, but it was just called the oldest gospel. And Marcion was one of several faith communities who used it. That is probably older. Why is it older? Because we have many examples of ancient literature, like letters of Ignatius or so. When they are interpolated, so they become, as they're copied, they become longer and longer, and additional texts, they always become longer, they never become shorter. It is very unlikely that the Gospel of Marcion would be a cut down version of the Gospel of Luke just from that first observation, because it's about a third shorter. And if you look at what was added, you know exactly why it was added. It was added to show that the New Testament is the second part of the Christian Bible, and that you cannot change, you cannot take away the Old Testament. This is something that, really reeks like editors of the Christian Bible having a strong interest. They did not only put out the New Testament, they also put out an edition of the Jewish writings in Greek. It looks quite different from our Old Testament that we're reading today.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and so this next question is, how accurate is it that Mark came first, then Matthew, then Luke, then John? So I'm guessing the patristic
That's a quick answer. This has been a tradition for about 200 years of working like that. It assumes that these are separate books that were written and read without knowing each other, and then they must somehow be connected to each other. Although this is 95% of the scholarship, I must just say, if you really want to follow the evidence, we have no evidence that these 4 books existed before the collection existed. It could very well be that, very well be that the person who made the Gospel of Luke from the Gospel of Marcion by adding a third also was responsible by having someone please write a gospel just from the perspective of Matthew, one of the 12 disciples. Yeah. So start with a genealogy, because you, as a tax collector, probably have access to records, the fictional character, and you be one of the 12 at the end, or one of the 11 at the end on the last scene, and let Jesus tell you, now go out into the world and bring the good news and to the nations, and not just to Israel. And this is what you do as you write this book. You write it in Greek, in the language of the nations. And for the second, just pretend, write something, you're Mark. Yeah, you're Mark, and you're the scribe of Peter. What did Peter say? So leave out everything where Peter wasn't there. He wasn't there at the birth of Jesus, for example. Don't talk about this. It's a creative writing experience. And then the Gospel of John, the 4th one, is, well, you already read 3. Now I'm going to tell you what I know in addition to that. So it does not tell the whole story, but it makes a commentary. It's one way of reading it. So, for example, when in Luke it says, well, there was this, the mom was crying and Jesus came, what's wrong? Well, my son died. Okay, brought him back to life. John says, no, I was there. This was Lazarus. His name's Lazarus. He's the brother of Mary. Gives you a whole chapter. If he reads the story of the, the whore that was wiping Jesus' feet and spending on, oh no, my God, this was Mary.
I've never heard somebody call it
that. So Gospel of John sort of is a commentary on the first three, and it makes sense if you know that you don't have Mark without John, you don't have Matthew without John. So asking these questions for the two source theory simply makes an assumption where I would, as a scholar, say, well, if these are really books from the first century in some kind, you may be right, but we have actually no indication that they existed before 150. Even if the stories existed, of course, and we have so much to compare it to. What is the Apocryphon of James? Well, he sits there and he writes a letter, and the other apostles are sitting around the same table. And so he writes down what he experienced from Jesus. No one says that this is a historical record. Or the second discourse of faith, which is my absolute favorite, where Jesus talks in first person singular. And he starts in heaven. Oh, when I was in heaven with my dad, and he said, you have to go down, I promised you. And then there was the evil forces. They wouldn't want to let me out of heaven. So I ship-shaped and came down, and I switched into the body. I just took the skin of a carpenter. So he becomes Jesus. And then when he's there at the final scene and he's nailed to the cross and dies, he laughs. He laughs at all those people who are sad. Don't they realize that I don't feel anything? It's like Monty Python. So here, no one has a problem telling the story with the voice of Jesus. No one has a problem telling a story with the voice of Matthew or with Mark or of Luke or of John or so. This is simply part of the genre. We even have examples from 20th, 21st century where people just, sometimes funny way, retell the Jesus story and pretend to be one of the characters. There's nothing wrong with that. If it weren't the Bible, we'd call it a documentary and put it in PBS and living narrative or whatever they call it. This is the genre that we're looking at with the four Gospels.
Okay, so you're saying like that the question is assumptive that they came in.
Yes, yeah. So I can't engage with it because it's for me it's ridiculously, it's so obviously wrong, and it's nothing a scholar should be involved in with. Really, I'm sorry to say that because, of course, all my colleagues, who've spent their lifeblood with questions like that, will not want to hear this. But the reconstruction of the source Q is something we have really no record of. It's simply a very smart and very witty and very thoughtful way of solving a problem. Why does Luke and Matthew have additional material that's not in Mark, and they present it in a similar way in the same arrangements? It must have been written down, otherwise the sequence wouldn't be the same. Okay. But if I have a gospel that is over, like Gospel of Marcion, I actually have some evidence. I can look at it, and then I can say, oh, there is no Q, because material that is supposed to be only in Q now shows up in Marcion. So the question becomes, whoever did this writing exercise, write about Jesus from the perspective of Matthew, write about Jesus from the perspective of a historian called Luke, used from that material whatever they felt was fit, and made something of it. There's really no necessary assumption that there was another written source there outside of the Gospel of Marcion, which you can look up on the web, or I've also produced a printed edition for my classes that you can buy. Matthias Klinghardt, who did the most serious, most profound, most careful reconstruction of the sources, reconstructed the text of Marcion, as good as you can with the sources that we have. And it is such an easy read and very enjoyable. And I loved using it in classes because it makes you just think a little differently.
Awesome. The next question is, Dr. Trobisch, since you're a critical scholar, you mentioned that one can't expect Gospels being perfect. How would you tell what is from the original and what's not when you can't compare to anything? I'm guessing that would be assumptive in saying that there is an original, or
it's a very good question. And it is really based on our textbooks, on the things that we use in academia and academic thing. But if you ask me personally as a critical scholar, which you did, I say, well, really, I'm not paid to say things that I don't know. There's no way I can get from evidence, and I really do know the text of the New Testament. I mean, I've edited it, so that you can make these assumptions, like the Jesus seminar did. This is really Jesus. This gets a different color. This gets a different color, and such and such. And they will give you their thoughts, but the assumption that they're reading a text from the first century is wrong. Be very clear. For me, there's no evidence for it, but I could not, with a straight face, continue to interpret Marcus being written before 70 just because it doesn't mention the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the same argument. Yeah, you don't have the Eusebian Canonus, so
the wire.
it must be older. Yeah, it's again the cell phone and the Babylonians.
Yeah, I've always
just
questioned
because
that.
it's not mentioned doesn't mean anything.
Right, and that part of internal evidence you can credit to a scribe or like a forger who says, okay, if I'm writing from a perspective of somebody who lived in the first century, let me not mention things that clearly or he lived beyond a certain time. I won't mention the fall of the temple. I won't mention things like that.
Yeah, it's the forgery. You can only forge documents. Yeah, a document is like a driver's license where there's only one copy that is valid. Mm-hmm. If you copy a driver's license, you can't use it anymore. The copy is not usable. And if you have it authenticated, then it becomes a document again because someone else put a stamp on it and so on. So we're not talking about forgery at all when it comes to New Testament writings. We're talking about dealing with literature. Let me go back, for example, to Sherlock Holmes, because I hope most people know it. Yeah, Sherlock Holmes did not exist. Dr. Watson did not. We know exactly who wrote it.
Wait, what? No, I'm just kidding.
Arthur Conan Doyle, And still, when you go to Baker Street 224B, there's a little sign. This is a fictional character, and then you step in, and they forget reminding you. Yeah, you see his pipe, you see his violin. It's everything exactly like it's in the book. This is what we do when we read. This is why we have literature. This is why we have art. It's an exercise in listening. Criticism is an exercise in correcting. Yeah. Well, if you want to read a mystery novel and want to correct it from page 1, be my guest, but you won't enjoy it. Yeah. Now, the New Testament should be appreciated as literature, a book from the 2nd century, where they're trying to make sense of what they know about Jesus the best they can. And they're basically in the same boat that we are. In changing times, we have these teachings, we have these texts. We try to make sense of it. That is the situation. And pretending that this is historical, Jesus really said that. So, well, we would have to have other sources than this particular book. It's just not fit to do this. You see, why did Josephus' writings survive to this day? Why? Because the church loved them. We copied them. It talks about Jesus. Yeah. There's this. It talks about John the Baptist, and so this is really great. So they would pay the monks to copy, the Antiquities, 7 volumes, just so they'd have also the Jewish War and information that they need about it. But if it is really a publication of the 2nd century, they of course looked Josephus up. They would never try to tell a story that doesn't make sense to an educated reader. And there are very few sources about the 1st century like Josephus. And Josephus was the publisher of the Jewish War, was the emperor of Rome who won that war. Yeah, and of course it was distributed like crazy. Everyone wanted it. It was a propaganda writing. It survived. Everyone would have known that in the 2nd century. So that we have, for example, the Quirinius and the having to count the population.
The census.
Yeah, the census. And of course, it's from Josephus. That he missed it by 11 years. Yeah, he got the dating wrong. Is unfortunate. The death of Jesus' brother is recorded in Josephus. So Josephus, if you think these are writings from the 1st century, you say, well, they are true because Josephus also says the same thing, and he's definitely not a Christian. He's independent. No, if you look at it from a 2nd century perspective, I mean, if I give a creative writing exercise, I really want my students to also do their homework and make sure that it is historically plausible, that they use Augustus and Tiberius as the emperors. But they don't know either. They just looked it up in books. And that we can still look it up in some of the books that they were able to use is end of the game. It doesn't prove anything.
Especially, look, I think I interviewed...
Historicity. It just proves what 2nd century readers thought, that it was historical.
Yeah, Mark Goodacre, he told me like that, not the idea, I don't think Steve Mason is the first to say that, but like that Luke especially utilized Josephus as gaining wide popularity. So.
Yeah.
And
also, McDonald's, there are writers who have shown how carefully Homer is used in the construction of the Book of Acts, which clearly does not pretend to be a document, but it is someone trying to do best with the records that he has, trying to tell the story of the early church. Yeah? And of course, you will have also read Homer and be very careful to find these parallels and do it. It's just, if you're a writer, professional writer, it's part of your skill and part of your craft.
Right. And so the next question, and actually, I want to add a little bit to it. It says, what evidence best suggests that the Gospels may have been 2nd century writings? And would you be able to recommend us some works on the topic? And can you speak just briefly about the role of, we spoke about it just in passing, the Apostolic Fathers, because an argument or a prevailing kind of sentiment is that the New Testament is already present in like Clement and the Didache and Barnabas. So like, of course, they're in the 1st century.
So the Apostolic Fathers, just very briefly, the dating of these writings are not what you read in the short history, the books. So you said, First Clement, he references the letters written to the Philippians, not even one letter, and he quotes from 1 Corinthians or so. Clement was around 100. Was it written? So he already knew that Clement was written about 100. Is what this letter, which is really a forgery. It's a document. A letter is a document. It's written by one. It's what they want to tell you. They want you to date it that way. But when you look at the manuscripts, you're hundreds of years away from that. The Apostolic Constitutions. Now, what did you mention? You mentioned not the Apostolic Constitutions, but the
Didache.
The Didache, yeah. Well, mid-2nd century, that's okay, Then what else did you have? Barnabas, letter to Barnabas. Come on, anyone who seriously wants to put that in the 1st century has a real problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
so
our first manuscript.
It leaves us. So basically the dating is to date it into 1st century would make sense of this question that the New Testament already existed, but we can't do that. If that was that clear, of course, everything I just said is ridiculous. So on a positive side, how can we date the New Testament to say what are the strongest arguments? The arguments of the manuscripts. We can reconstruct an edition of the New Testament in 27 writings. By 180, Tertullian, by 180, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, know it. They know the name New Testament. They reference 27 writings. They have the editorial decisions about the names of the authors. They've got Matthew, Mark, which are not mentioned in the text. Yeah, John, these are this is the editorial narrative of a collection. They can quote it. So I worked professionally a lot with collectors of material, and they all, if they want to buy something that's really old, they need a provenance narrative. They need to know where it comes from. And that is the second observation, that you have a provenance narrative. Irenaeus is one of them who writes them out very nicely, who says who Matthew and Mark and Luke and John is, where they did that, and where Paul wrote which letter and such and such and such. This is clearly what you need to sell a miraculous discovery. For hundreds of years, the background of the editorial narrative of the New Testament is the following. These are writings from the 1st century that have survived miraculously, by the church, Irenaeus says the church has kept them, in a secret place, in a good and safe place. But what we can deduce from it, historically, they were published in the 2nd century. Otherwise, he would not have to say that. Mm-hmm. You see the same, you see the same with Apocryphon of James. I write it in Hebrew and don't give it to anyone, as long as they're alive. But when they're not alive, and here the publisher says, here, I found something. It was kept secret until now. Book of Daniel is not written at the time when the text is told. The Book of Daniel is probably written during the Maccabean Wars. How do we know that? So you cannot just go into the story and just because you have a Robin Hood doing something, it means that Robin Hood actually existed, or King Arthur, or anything like this. The story does exist, and it's continued to be told and such and such. So how do we know in the 2nd century? The provenance narrative, the manuscripts, but we also have comparable literature, Christian literature, and we have a lot. I say at least 100 other writings that could compete with the genre of Christian gospels and letters and such and such. And then, if you have a genre, you can see, where obviously some of the writings that are in the New Testament are not really written by the author. There, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy is typically a candidate, not written by Paul, or letter to Hebrews or so. Where do we have collections as a genre that mix authentic material with literary material, with forgeries? And then you can look around, and you have in history a lot of examples. The letters of Ignatius are old ones, apostolic constitutions. I work so in my recent book, the origin of the on the origin of Christian scripture. I give you examples that have nothing to do with Christianity, but just show you that these mixing genuine and literary material into one collection is usually used for political gain. After 9/11, I think of the faxes that were found that started in the faxes in Africa, from Africa, that started the first Iraq War or so, and then turns out they're probably made by the CIA or something like that. And so you find, or in Germany had the big problem with the diaries of Adolf Hitler that surfaced all of a sudden, and such and such. It is this kind of collections that you can compare it to, and you can understand how the genre works. It presents itself as a miraculous discovery 100 years after Jesus lived, that gives the audience a collection of authentic writings of the 1st century to compete with other editions, like the Gospel of Marcion and their community, the Marcionite community and other communities who also had writings, or at least one writing. And if you can establish that place of publication and what they are addressing, then you also have a clear argument for dating it. So if the letters of Ignatius at the end have 14 letters, the last 2 letters, Ignatius writes that the older collections have fewer, and the last medieval collection has 14 letters. And the last 2 ones that were missing in the previous one are letters that Ignatius writes to Mary, Mother of God. Mm-hmm. Now, he can only write a letter like that if the dogma of Mary being Mother of God is acceptable, which is in the 12th century. And now you can date this particular edition. This is when it was published. It could not have been published before that. So you have that in the Four Gospel book. In one particular place, this is what I also argue in the book that might be very helpful. Why don't we know when Jesus died? Why don't we celebrate, let's say, the 2020th year or 2005th year of his death? We can't. The problem is because the dating of Jesus' death between the three first Gospels and the Gospel of John are not the same. In the first three Gospels, Jesus celebrates the Passover, has the Passover meal, and dies the next day. But in the fourth Gospel, Jesus dies at the same time that the Passover lamb is slaughtered in the temple. Jesus dies on the cross, so he could not have had the Passover meal. Both accounts agree that it's on a Friday, but because the Passover is based on the moon year, if the Passover is on a Friday or the day before Friday, it will be in different years. Mm-hmm. So this problem is really when to celebrate Easter. And we can show with Irenaeus the year between 150 and 200, so let's say around 180, this was the discussion of the church. And as this was discussed, the Gospels were published, and the Four Gospel volume was published, saying, I'm going to give you the short story. The Bishop Polycarp from Asia Minor travels to Rome to talk with the Bishop of Rome about this question.
And it was Anicetus, I think.
Yes, Anicetus. And then they both agree, well, we really have bigger problems than that, don't we? Everyone just celebrate. You celebrate according to the Gospel of John. We celebrate according to Peter and the Gospel of Mark. And let's just be friends. Now, if this collection, an editorial narrative, says exactly the same thing that was the solution for that difficult moment, you probably have a really good argument to know when it was published. I can show that with this genre, this pseudo-Isaurian decretals were published at a time where there was a legal issue in southern France, and they showed up with a defense as a miraculous discovery. Whoa, it's a forgery. It just tries to help the defense make a case, and it tells you that it tells you what the Pope said in the first century. So it's exactly the same thing. The New Testament, a new discovery. Whoa, of first century documents. Excellent, wonderful. And they will solve our problems, including the problem that no one could have known at the time yet in the first century, that we will discuss when Jesus has to die and how important this is. First Timothy is another one where he says, well, don't follow the gnosis, the so-called
gnosis. You took the words out of my brain. I was going to ask you about that passage.
So we call them anachronisms when it comes to dating literary bodies with an editorial narrative.
Wow.
You look for events where you have independent records that this event happened. Mm-hmm. If it were, let's say, in the 6th century, there was a big earthquake, 537 or something like that destroyed much of northern Syria and left, to this day, wide regions that have never been repopulated. But these were real cities. The lost cities, you can walk through the ruins. I've been there several times. And if a literary record written mentions this here, it mentions a huge earthquake in the Mediterranean, then you have a real good indication when that person lived, So this is who put it together. And if the story is really about a person that lived 300 years before that, you can now say this is when it was published, right. This particular one. Otherwise, you could not have told the story that way. So there are plenty of criterion, and although there's small community of scholars, and I think some of them you've already invited, that says let's just hold our breath. Let's just be a little more real. The 2nd century is where the New Testament shows up for the first time. Let's first understand what it meant at that time, which questions it answered. Let's understand the genre better. Let's look at the competing literature. And then, if we still feel comfortable enough, go back and ask questions about Jesus, historical questions.
Yeah.
The New Testament, this is the other thing. Why is it so popular? It wasn't that popular in the 2nd century. It becomes popular with Constantine. When Constantine decides that among all the different Christian communities, he's going to side with the Catholic Christian community, which is quite different from a lot of others that we know and that are reflected in competing Christian literature of the 2nd century. That's when the New Testament was endorsed and when all competing records had a hard time to survive on a book market. And so this is really the story of how the Catholic Church came to be. This is the foundation story of the Catholic Church, the New Testament. We have Peter, we have a Paul, both of them are revered here in Rome. We have our church, they're both buried next to each other. Those are the two big characters of the New Testament. Then I'll tell you a little more about Peter and Jesus, then I'll tell you a little more about Paul, his followers, who resemble us. Because the movement is not a Jesus movement, it's Christianity. The experience of historical Jesus is lost 100 years after Jesus' death. But the experience of the living Christ, the spiritual experience, is not lost, not to this day. For one semester, I taught at Memphis, and there they would talk, the King lives. They're talking about Elvis. And it is this kind of life that continues. This musicians' artwork there's a resonance. It will continue as long as the text still speaks to an audience.
Scholars will continue to.
Yeah. And so from a scholarly point of view, this is not literary studies of literature. It is really a historical approach, but simply saying all the methods you've been using, they're all right, they're correct. You've just been using it 100 years for sources that are 100 years too early.
Oh, yeah, that was an excellent question. I think I've had you much longer than we planned.
Yeah. Don't worry. I don't have an appointment immediately.
You sure?
Oh, yes,
okay.
I'm sure.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So somebody asked a question about the Papias fragments and
yes.
their role in current scholarships, placing the Gospels in a particular timeline.
Yeah, it's, I was very dismissive with the Apostolic Fathers early on, when you asked me the question.
Yeah.
Papias is just the same. The dating of Papias is so difficult. When I, as a student, I was sort of left with the belief that this is about 110, which would be, wow, we really question everything. Mm-hmm. But then I look into it and you find datings 130 is, I think, now more the mainstream, but you can also find people put it around 150. So it's already contemporary to the New Testament. It doesn't really give me the kind of insight that I was hoping for. However, a guy who says that he wrote 5 volumes. By the way, we only have we don't have too much from him, but we have from his forward, from his preface, the idea, why did he write it at all? He said, well, there's so much has been written about Jesus. Well, it sounds like New Testament and the other many other books that are out there. But so that also sounds like it. But I'm only going to write down things that I heard that were in the oral tradition that have not yet been written down, and so I'll write them down now. This is also a nice parallel to the Quran, the early days of the Quran, how it was transmitted through oral transmission, mm-hmm. and then the moment when it has started to be written down, it's a little bit of a myth. Anything that's written down becomes more valuable. All of a sudden you have an artifact and such and such. But this is also with what the Papias works with. He says, we may have read a lot of things, but I have oral tradition. Now I'm going to write them down, and you can correct other things that you've already read if you want to.
Similar to Luke's prologue, really.
Yes, yeah. Of course, Luke does exactly the same. Read Luke as a 2nd century okay. I
Because
study the
many
sources
people,
again and bring them in order. I do, so yeah, it's, yeah. The thing is, I could interpret every single book of the New Testament from this new perspective. Mhm. Um, when I suggested that to my publisher, I've suggested several times, the feedback was always couldn't be anything more boring than that. Who's interested in the Bible the second sentence? If you tell me if it would help me to see what Jesus says about nuclear power plants, yes, please go. Yeah, we can sign, but that's too, no, it's too far away. But so the introduction to Luke would be something we could talk about a long time. He's making up his publisher, Theophilus, and that might just really be the pseudonym of the publisher of the whole New Testament.
I know, yeah, that's what you
The
said.
term Theophilus, those who love, person who loves God. Would you know a better word, better self-designation than someone who sits down and does the hard work of collecting stuff and so putting it together in a loving manner? The big editorial project was really putting out an edition of the Old Testament. Compared to that, the New Testament is just an appendix. Yeah.
Wow.
Easily done. Yeah.
I know in Vincent's book, Marcion
Yes.
and the Dating of the Synoptic Gospels, he only has like a tiny section on who Theophilus, the patron of the gospel, the patron of the gospel according to Luke, would be. And in the footnote, it's very funny. He just says Theophilus of Antioch ? Like because we really don't know of any other personal Theophilus from that time
Yeah.
period. Is that what are your thoughts on
Well,
Gospels
yes, Theophilus of Antioch is someone, of course, you think of immediately. It's it is this tongue-in-cheek kind of thing that you sometimes find when people use a pen name. Yeah, they don't necessarily they may want you to identify them, without really saying it. No one would say that the Theophilus of the first century could possibly be the Theophilus of Antioch. Yeah, who was a historical figure and very much involved in New Testament knowledge and such and such. But for 12 years I taught in Maine. I lived in Bangor and my neighbor was Stephen King. So I was doing so when I walked my dog, he walked his dog, he would meet at the grocery store, things like that. And also my inaugural lecture was about the historicity of the Acts of the Apostles and the writings of Stephen King. To show that when you look at literature from a historical point of view, you can't use face value judgments. You need to have sources that are independent of the literature that you're reading in order to establish what's historical and what isn't. And Stephen King in his early years wrote so many books that his publishers refused to publish them. He could put out 3 novels and they would tell him, nope, we can only do 1 at a time and you'll be the best-selling author in this year. But if you give us 3, we'll dilute the market. And so he started to write with other names. One of them was Bachman. And being his neighbor and living there, I realized when you read this book that one of the central scene, what is it called? It's Gypsy, he keeps losing weight, forget what the name of it is. The central scene of that book where the resolution comes, he describes exactly, you go into this and this town, Salem, which is always used in other books, but it's really Bangor, and you follow the road and you pass by the theological seminary, where I was teaching, and you go. He leads you up into the garden, into his right in front of his house, and you sit on the bench on his lot, and there's where the big dialogue is, where everything is going to be resolved. But of course, you're reading a book by a certain Mr. Bachman, who never heard of before, and such. You never make the connection that could be a Stephen King book or such and such. But he leaves, really, once you know it, you get all these clues. And so it could very well be that Theophilus of Antioch is somehow involved. This is pure speculation, but with literature, if you enjoy reading Sherlock Holmes, a guy who never lived, why not think about Theophilus? It could be just a character you need to think about in the 2nd century. That would also be enough to use that name. You're familiar with people who edit other books, who publish books, which bishops did. Bishop Polycarp is the editor of the Letters of Ignatius. And just, it's a playful way of working with it. Historical research does not always help with interpreting literature, so it's just that you have a text means absolutely nothing. And a text is a text. Only if you put it in a context, it develops meaning. And so whether this is important to know that Theophilus of Antioch might have been the author, may have paid for it, or just really liked it, or after he saw his name there, immediately bought 100 copies and promoted it, whatever. There could be a lot of different roles that he could have, but the connection is a good one. And as far as I know, it not really has been scholarly researched well enough. These are the kind of books I would love to read.
Yeah.
They would have to do more with the New Testament than what I'm reading at the moment.
And what's I know, like, in every book that I've read so far, including the Nestle Allen, I mean, there's scant references also, like this is the reading that's found in Marcion. They'll have MRCN.
Yeah.
The reading that's found in Marcion, and then even Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism by Amfu. He says Marcion.
Yes, Amfu. Oh, you're familiar with him.
Oh yeah, I love
Quite
and Duplessis, but he says that Marcion was the Big Bang of the New Testament. And how, I want to, like, in your field, how prevalent it, because I know Jack Bull told me differently, that he would go to conferences and people just have like a very passing knowledge of Marcion's influence.
Yes, right.
So is that something that's getting better? Like, people are understanding his role
absolutely.
in Christianity?
Absolutely. What would that have been, 2004 or something? Went to San Diego, SBL meeting in San Diego. And I think it was the first group that I was aware of that deals with Marcion. A year after that, there were already 4 groups. And now when you go, you just, you have a lot. Wow. What started it is that there are about 6 dissertations that were published or independently of each other, or 6 books written, and some of them are dissertations. And they all came to the conclusion that the Marcion gospel must be older than the gospel of Luke.
This is at the SBL conference?
No, they're published. If you look at the whatever, Matthias Klingert in the edition, if you go to the bibliography, you have them immediately, and you would probably know them, but I'm blanking. Because what's important is the or read my book, then you have it in the footnotes. You have them listed, of course, and they all came to the conclusion, with one exception, that Marcion must be older than the Gospel of Luke. And this was putting everything on just the other way, the way I was taught as a student. Of course, Marcion was going with Irenaeus and Tertullian and all the negative comments about him that say he's the little mouse, the pontic mouse that bites away on the gospel and he takes things away. That is absolutely ridiculous. That it doesn't work that way. It works the other way around just very, very well. And because they came to it really independently, it has a little bit more value. And the one person who didn't come up with that sequence didn't come up with it because he said, that's a question I don't want to ask. So he also doesn't say it's the opposite way. And that sort of triggered something. And then the next problem is you can't get a good edition. You fall back to Harnack. And Harnack changed his mind during his lifetime. It's very hard to make too much sense out of it. It's really something for the specialists. Like Marcus Vincent to tell you how it changed and why and when and such and such. So my personal assessment is that it has to do that the scholars simply don't have an edition of Marcion that they can reference. Yeah, it's not that. Which just a second. Yes, here. So Matthias Klinghardt, who is also we studied together in Heidelberg at the same time. So I talked him into putting a Greek English edition of the Marcionine text out without all the commentary and everything. So here, let's see how much you can see. Here's the Greek text, and in the same, you can't see it very well, and the English column just next to it. Wow. And there's noted a list what is different from Luke and things like that. And that for the first time is a reference that you can reference. So if you look for, he calls it Sterne Evangelium, Matthias Klinghardt, Klinghardt. You get it on Amazon, or just an English edition of the text as well. It's now readily available. But I think that is my best answer for you. My colleagues here in Heidelberg, which I visit occasionally, they don't know where to go to look at the text. So for them, it's all they reference and what they hear are things that they will hear in communication with me or others, and say there's a third more text in there. Oh, really? Okay. But they don't look at what it actually is and much we know about it, and so.
I know Bedouin has a good reconstruction too.
Yeah, Bedouin it's good, but it's not the Greek text. But you mentioned before, Dr. who invited Bull.
Jack Bull.
Yeah, Jack Bull. Yeah, they have an edition that is electronic. Yeah, electronic, which is great, and I hope it will. It's still like that. If it's not in a library, scholars tend not to be aware of it. They will never buy the book, but they want it to be as a printed book in the library, and then they go online and get it as a electronic, and then they're pissed off if they can't get it for free.
No, if you guys visit Patristica, I forgot which video it's under, but if under one of their discussions around Marcion, in the description of the video, they'll actually have a link to the website that they're using to archive the apostolos, at least.
Still, so I did when I was teaching at Memphis. This was at a Jewish in the Jewish department, and they wanted me to talk about gospel literature, and of course, found the right person, because it's a Jewish genre. I mean, plenty of books like that. It's not. I mean, Christians in the 2nd century are still Jewish. I mean, they see themselves as true Jews. So if you look at it from a literary point of view, Catholicism happens when you decide you need a bishop. You have a Christian Bible, and you have a creed. Yeah, these three things have to come together. No, this is not together yet. There are 150. You have a lot of different wild movements, and the identity. How Jewish are we is a question that they are all asking. And Marcion, taking a little bit of a wild stand, saying we're not Jewish anymore, is not the Catholic position. We are. Jesus was a Jew. Certainly not German Lutheran position of the 21st century. After the Holocaust, Jesus is a Jew. Clearly. So that this will never happen again. And so. Yeah. So answering that question, I think there have to be more editions readily available for those who teach New Testament. Just a little printed book or so, it's $8-9 or something like that. That just has the English text with it, and then you can look it up in your own Bible and have a few helps. It's a wonderful icebreaker.
Okay.
Because people will recognize, oh my God, it looks so familiar, and then they start comparing it, and they see what was left out, what was taken out.
Yeah,
why was it added? Let's put it this way: why was it added? This and that and that. Clearly, it's not difficult to realize that they're endorsing the New Testament. the editorial narrative of the New Testament is this is the fulfillment of promises that God has given to Israel. This is the title, New and Old. Old Testament. New Testament is a reference to 2 Corinthians chapter 2 or 3. The Old Testament is written on stone. Yeah. The New Testament is written in spirit. Yeah. So they took this title for this book to say we're not talking about Jesus anymore. We're now talking about Christ. And so often you hear that Paul invented Christianity, or so I'm not quite sure who said that the first time.
Mhm.
But the truth is that he didn't know Jesus, and that this is important for the narrative. One more thing that I think I need to say to show how shocking the results could probably be if you follow down the line. New Testament is a book of the 2nd century. We see that the Gospels, maybe they are very creative writing exercises. Christians have always loved to tell stories. That really puts a different light on the letters of Paul, because we really have no evidence that Paul could put the letters of Paul in the 1st century setting, that they existed. I mean, from a manuscript, they did not exist. And the few things that we have in Galatians, that, well, my God, all he had to do was read Josephus, and he will come up that Damascus had a problem with because of a question about who the king married. King Herod came over, and he was looking for them. He was friends with the Nabateans, and so this doesn't mean that this actually happened that way. It just means that someone studied this Josephus and was a little bit fascinated with the story of John the Baptist, which is, and I could go on forever, which is the biggest mistake that the gospel writers do. They think that John the Baptist died before Jesus died, whereas Josephus says that's not true. The way Josephus tells the story, John the Baptist continues to live. It's a little bit difficult to interpret because Josephus usually follows the timeline very careful in his writing, but in one case he has almost like an appendix. He has a flashback to something he should have told earlier on, and so they draw a wrong conclusion that a historian today probably would not draw. I'm surprised that there's not more discussion.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's and in this case, because we talked about how can you show that these people know each other, that these gospels are somehow connected, which has always been. If with manuscripts, you can see if two manuscripts, that you have two independent manuscripts, you can say that they copied the same manuscript if they copied this Leitfehler, the same errors.
Like Polycarp's manuscripts that end at like chapter 9 and then begin at the same section in Barnabas.
Perfect. Yeah. Perfect example. The New Testament manuscripts F and G copy a bilingual manuscript. In that bilingual manuscript, 5 pages were missing. They have no other manuscript to compare it with. So how do they deal with it? So, and because these 5 pages, and there are pages missing, which means in the middle of a sentence, the text stops. In the middle of a sentence, it picks up again. Now, if 2 manuscripts have exactly the same lacuna, the same missing piece, that they were looking at the same copy.
Absolutely.
And so making the same mistake with the dating of John the Baptist in all 4 Gospels would be, if I'm right about that,
Wow.
And it could be a really strong argument that this was written, with the same historical theory that somehow was flawed, but that these 4 Gospels have something in common in this respect. John the Baptist plays no role in Marcion. This is why it's important.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an addition, canonical editors, as I like to call them. I call it the canonical edition because the term New Testament, few people think about 27 writings in this order. They also think, Jesus is in the New Testament, so it's about Jesus. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an edition It just has the title New Testament, and I call it the canonical edition because that's what we all read, and it must have had a beginning somewhere. That someone must have put it together. And I now, at the end of my career, think from what I've learned in my life, I was interested in that question. It's in the middle to second half of the second century, and God bless it.
Yeah,
I love the New Testament. I read it every day, and I'm
that's
glad this has been my job. This doesn't diminish anything.
right. That somber feeling is very reminiscent of when I first heard about this too, and when I interviewed Dr. Jack Bull, he said the same thing.
Yeah.
He's like, it doesn't do anything for my faith. My faith kind of like is tangential to that. I'm more interested in where this came from. What can we say about it? What can we pin on it in terms of epistemology in our life? So, and as far as a faith perspective, a lot of people do have like two hats that they put on. But it's very interesting that, and I'm glad that this this knowledge about Marcion's role in the entire New Testament project, even the term New Testament, I know people like Vincent, they say it was coined as a direct, kind of appeal to Marcion, who was making distinctions.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not the first one, Vincent, to say that the title is really, this was the title of Marcion's book, New Testament.
And you said Harnack initially held to Marcionite priority and then changed his mind, or vice versa.
Yeah, he changed. Well, the thing is, he changed it back and such. It was actually when he was a student. He didn't even have a doctoral degree, where they had a writing competition for the best paper, where he wrote his first book on Marcion. And then it stuck with him, and he rewrote it. I what should I say? I honored Harnack always very much, and actually like.
I have his History of Dogma right here.
Yeah, reading his books or so. But in this particular, with Marcion, I was not impressed. Maybe he should have written that after he got his dissertation.
You're more of a John Knox guy, probably, yeah?
Yes, John Knox I like very much. He's like, my problem is, I'm a missionary kid. I grew up in Africa. I spoke 4 languages when I was 5, and now I have about 12 languages that I can deal with. Wow. But I don't really fit. I don't fit into a typical faith community. Yeah, so kind of thing that's not really important to me. But I also don't fit into academia the way other ones do. For them it means a lot that they have this and that chair, and it doesn't mean anything to me, and it never has. And so, unfortunately, it's also. I love the classroom. I love people with real questions. I love reading the Bible, reading the text together and such. But I have no love for the speculative historical theories, and find myself being perceived by others as being a wild speculator. Yeah, there's absolutely no evidence.
It's strange.
I think I could have a few little anecdotes about that I could tell about my colleagues without naming names, but I don't want to do it. But it's not, you would rather begin a conversation, and the people you talk to are people who may have spent much of their life researching Q, or I may also have spent a lot of research money doing that with an institute and so on. So it becomes, so it's not a faith community, but the scholarly community also becomes very vulnerable. And especially if you say, well, it's so obvious.
Yeah.
It's so obvious that the New Testament has an editorial narrative. You don't understand Luke without reading first. And this is what a colleague, not every colleague will enjoy hearing. It really, It's like the first sentence in the Gospel of Thomas. Just look at it, it's before your eyes. It's so obvious.
Uh,
And
and
then mm,
that reminds me of something that I've been meaning to ask. So I've read Kester's work. I've read
yes,
um, Elaine Pagels and
yeah,
Ron Cameron, people who deal with like apocryphal texts.
yeah,
And there's this interesting story in the Gospel according to Mark, where like a young man flees naked at the end of
yeah.
Mark chapter 15,
Mhm.
and then there's this other version of Mark called Secret Mark, which was
Secret mark,
prepared
yeah.
by Martin Smith. And
Yes,
DC Parker completely dismissed it. Like in the beginning of his text, he's like, "I don't like the Byzantine text. There are no Christian manuscripts at Qumran, and Secret Mark is a forgery. These are the three things that I will never, I'll never negotiate on." But is that because like you don't understand really what happened, like why Mark would include that there if the Secret Mark wasn't available, and some people say, well, that's the motivation behind forging this Secret Mark.
exactly.
What do you think about that text?
Yeah, it's for me it's rather easy. It goes either way. If you see an insertion, yeah, insertion or deletion, what could you do?
Hmm.
When you editors that produce a text from scratch, or the first editors, they always have to select. Yeah, it's always deleting. But when it comes to manuscript transmission, you don't see that anymore. The text becomes longer. Yeah? They will never leave out something even if they don't like it. Look at the NRSV or things like that with the adulterous woman. It's really not in our Bibles anymore. Well, it is, but it's in brackets. It's small. I remember in Maine going to a church, and that was the text that the pastor was preaching about, and he had his whole sermon, but he first had to read it, and then he couldn't find it. I thought this was so great. And then he had to get his goggles because they put it in the footnote, and I
No.
was sitting like this. So the whole effect of that sermon was gone. So even now we don't delete things. The Nestle Aland has more commentary than it has text. It's a 1,000-page edition, now, and most of it, and much of it is appendices and introduction. We don't leave anything out, and this is such a selection of readings. If you look at the Editio Critica Maio, you have one line on top, and the rest of the page is just the variants for this one line.
Like the
Um,
Markan ending and it gets even longer.
Yeah, so, but still, when you argue, what's the predecessor of the canonical mark? Yeah, did it look different? Did it have that or so? It's a legitimate question. For me, it's not important because I really see myself as a professor of the New Testament, and I can assure you that this does not belong to the text of the archetype. Yeah, it's not part of the New Testament. But other than that, it's a lot of fun following this up.
Mhm.
And I've also I've worked with other people trying to, Charlie Hedrick, who is the one person where I first saw a photograph of the secret Mark fragment, or so, was a colleague I taught for a while in Springfield, Missouri State University. I filled in for a
You've
professor
taught,
who
you've
retired.
taught everywhere, man.
Wow, yeah, that was college. That was an introduction to college, and I understood that religious departments in American society have a really important function. That was the only time really where you had a Catholic sitting next to a Pentecostal sitting next to an obnoxious libertarian and who doesn't believe anything, and did actually talk to each other. So in American culture, you go to your faith meetings, and if you're not presented at college or with a different opinion about something, you probably can go through life, be an educated lawyer or whatever, and never hear anything. So I really enjoyed that. So that a little bit aside. So um, yeah, I also like the guy. Um, he had a lot of fun in his life. I think he was a homosexual, so he really also had trouble in that aspect. In academia, or at his time at least. And so um, I like those stories. They're funny. They're nice. He forged it. He defined it. I had a friend who went there to the library and they wouldn't give him the copy. Then I have emails with him inviting to go to Alexandria because they have this original now went to Alexandria and is there in the Metropolitan. Hi, yeah. For years I did provenance research and helped dealers doing these kind of things or so. It's you never know what it is,
Yeah.
but it's fun. So it's yeah. The end of the Gospel of Mark is clearly one of the things that invites you as a reader of the New Testament to use your imagination and come up with at least 3 ideas, which would be a good Talmudic way of solving the problem of the last sentence. Now, the women are told to go to the apostles and tell them that Jesus was resurrected in the last sentences, but they didn't tell anyone because they were so afraid. This is just about the worst imaginable sentence you could come up with for the end of a gospel. Jesus hasn't even appeared yet as a resurrected person.
How do they find out?
This funny, the whole thing the gospel is about is not, ends there. Yeah? And this is wonderful. I like it. This is, for me, gospel. I've also, you may not know that, but I also have expertise in storytelling, biblical storytelling. I wrote a book about that as well.
Oh.
And Mark is a storyteller. Yeah, he doesn't clean it up. Yeah, so Jesus, first you hear that John the Baptist baptizes everyone for the forgiveness of sins. They go in the water and forgiven. And then Jesus came and he baptized Jesus. Okay, so Jesus is a sinner. Oh my dear. Yeah. Matthew, no, don't. John was saying, don't baptize. No, I have to be baptized by you.
You gotta baptize me. Yeah.
And then Jesus pulls out his pocket Bible and says, no, it says here, you have to baptize me. I don't know why it says that. And they do it. And so this is this kind of what I would advocate with reading these texts. They want to be funny. Yeah. So when Jesus says, don't, when you pray, don't do it like the Pharisees. Don't go to the street corner and have someone with a trumpet in front of you so everyone sees you. And so, but if you want to pray, then go and lock yourself up in the room and God can see into your heart. There's only one room that you can lock up, and that's the bathroom. This is a bathroom joke. Yeah. And then when you think of it that way, you see, well, no one would have someone with a trumpet in front of them when they go praying. No one would stand at the street corner and say, I'm praying. It's this kind of stand-up comedian thing where you exaggerate, it's Seinfeld, or you exaggerate a situation until everyone, and then at the end, well, Jesus is talking about a bathroom,
Hyperbole.
So, yeah. And then not even whoever put the Gospel of Matthew together gets it. Then he says, no, when you're there, then pray the following way. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. No. He already, So these texts are full of nuances, and they are really, manuscripts in antiquity were prompts for performance. If you've ever seen a New Testament manuscript, you see that there are no spaces between the words, no commas, no question. You cannot read that in a way that a listening audience would appreciate it unless you really prepared it. You basically have to memorize it, and the text becomes a prompt. And this is what these texts are about. So all these things, like the guy losing his tunic, and running away naked. Well, imagine you having to perform that in front of an audience, yeah? Oh, there are 1,000 ideas how you could do that.
Oh, it's just like a humorous aside, basically.
Sure. And why not have a woman do the text about a guy? You can defamiliarize the different ways of telling the same story in the 4 Gospels. Also works with techniques of defamiliarizing something that you're very familiar with and making it more memorable this way. Yeah, you see, we're veering off. And so,
no, that was just like a question that I had in terms of like the intertextuality between Secret Mark and Mark. But yeah, I think we definitely have to wrap up now because it's been like 2 hours.
Yeah.
And yeah, but
Okay.
it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. I mean, we talked about manuscript decisions, your role as a committee member in Dynasty Island 28. We talked about your stance on Marcion and how that's progressed. Even your incredible, very logical approach to how the New Testament was formed and how it was published and disseminated. So this to me is like very kind of intuitive, and I appreciate that type of scholarship where you say, these theories are speculative, but what do we know for
Yeah,
sure? The manuscripts start here. They seem
exactly.
to involve one another in the actual text, and so therefore we take that as it is. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with in terms of your future projects or what you want them to come up with when looking at your work?
Well, it's it's not about. I've tried never to make it about me, but about the evidence that we're looking at, about the texts that we have. And if there's one thought, if you could remember that, it's just simply that the New Testament is a publication of the second century. And I, I'll stand for that with my scholarly ethos. And I don't think this is speculative. If anything, it might be a little bit too, if you say, it's too careful. Maybe I should be more daring and say it was 158 September when when they visited, when Polycarp visited Anicetus, or something like that. But it's publication of second century. One more thing that might help you. We had a colleague here, Axel Knauf, who got his habilitation in Heidelberg, and he used this big inaugural lecture, where he can show off about the historical place of the Book of Job. Yeah, where was it written? Who wrote it? Where? When? Why? And he had lived in Jordan for a long time, perfect in Aramaic. He's just absolutely the most learned guy you could possibly think to talk about something like that. He had all the parallels and quotes, including from. And so, and then at the end he said, now I need to answer the question of the whole speech. Where is it? And he said the historical place of the Book of Job is world literature.
Mm-hmm.
It has its place in the 21st century as much as it had it in 4th century BC. And I thought, yes, that's what I can say about the New Testament. It's historical places in world literature. But if you'd want to know where it began, want to learn a little more about what possible theories about the archetype, you might look at my thoughts. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for gracing us. You stayed much longer than I wanted. Yeah, no, I didn't want to like inconvenience you. You have a lot of work, but we could do this all day, and maybe we can have a follow up in the future, God willing. So thank you to everyone who attended, who asked the questions. Definitely pick up his books on the origin of Christian scripture. Amazing work.
Fortress Press. I think this would be the best for the
layman
in regard to this interview. Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. And then if you want to learn about like Marcion and his impact, then the first edition of the New Testament would be your next purchase, God willing. So
it's a really scholarly book. But the other one is more approachable.
Absolutely. So again, thank you all, and inshallah ta'ala, we'll see you on the next one.
Okay.
In Islam, we like to end with just a little prayer. So we say
Yes, please.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. And so greetings and peace be upon everyone.
Bye.